Hello there, I'm Mike Creevy for Homeschool Connections, and with me today is Mrs. Henry to talk about her courses at Homeschool Connections. How are you doing?
Hi, I'm doing well. Thank you for having me.
Oh, of course, yeah. And I've been asking everybody to just share with us a little bit about your own background, your own interests, your own skill set, whatever you want to get into as far as what brought you to Homeschool Connections.
Well, I am an alumna of Hillsdale College, and I focused on classical studies, and my concentration was Latin. And so after graduating from college, I just really wanted to teach Latin, and I did that for a bunch of different homeschool co-ops in the Midwest for a while, and eventually met Maureen Whitman, who is one of the co-founders of Homeschool Connections. And I worked with her students and just developed a great relationship with her and eventually started working for Homeschool Connections shortly after that.
Wonderful, yeah. And so with your interest in Latin, was that something that really was with you for a really long time, or kind of developed? Like, what's the background
No,
on that?
honestly, I don't even think I really ever gave any thought to Latin until I attended college and it was a
Wow.
required course. And I fell in love with it as a required course. I had a fantastic professor who had a unique approach that I've taken on myself in my teaching style and just really loved it and wanted to. I love language, I love words, I love literature, all of that. And so
Yeah.
Latin really is kind of the foundation for Romance languages and a lot of Western culture. And so to have that kind of as my foundation, it gives me a lot to branch off from.
Sure. And at the risk of sounding, it's not, a purely utilitarian thing, of course, but the truth of how how much in the background or on the foundation it really is for everything from, genus of animals and trees and, and plants and stuff
Yes,
to law
yes,
to theology to,
yes.
just this whole intellectual tradition. So it's
Exactly.
definitely a cornerstone.
It is. It's very, very broad. It's a wonderful foundation for everything you just said. So
Sure.
yes.
And this, I'm putting you on the spot here, but I'm just curious because I was speaking with a Latin teacher friend of mine, and it just seems to me, and maybe as I kind of myself journey more into the kind of classical education world myself, it seems to me, at least anecdotally, like there's a lot more Latin out there right now than maybe there was 20 years ago, at least from what I've seen as far as people's interest, people, hiring for Latin teacher positions. Like it seems like
Yes.
everywhere I look, there's more Latin.
Yes, the classical education model is getting more and more popular, and we are finding that there is a has been a huge resurgence and interest in the Latin language. It used to be required, and I think even in the public education system, I think that ended somewhere in the 1950s or 60s. And so here we are now, about 60 years later, 70 years later, finding it kind of circling back around, and people are extremely interested in it, and it's very exciting
Sure.
to see that.
Well, and I direct people's attention to when I was talking to Olivia Jones for Homeschool Connections also a little while ago, and she shared a fun story about being able to break the language barrier and speak with this priest for a long time in
Yes,
Latin, and
yes,
actually have a full conversation. I thought that's like one of the coolest things.
yes, yes, yes. She's very strong in the immersion program that she
Yeah.
came out from, and I love seeing that and how enriching that can be for people.
Well, so tell us a little bit about so your classroom setting. Let's say we got a student in there, or a family members kind of observing. What can people expect? Like, what's it like? You said your method's a little unique or based largely on this professor that you had. How do you approach the actual instruction?
So I approach it a little differently than a lot of Latin instructors. Our focus at Homeschool Connections is actually on the system of the language and the
Hmm.
patterns within the language. So I do not have my students do rote memorization or memorize paradigms or go over lists. Instead, it's kind of a cross between immersion and rote memorization. I'm kind of in the middle of that, where I kind of
Okay.
blend both and I help my students see the patterns in the language. And once you do that, because it's an inflected language, which means
Hmm.
the endings, when the endings change, word placement doesn't necessarily change. When the endings change, that changes the meaning of the word and its role in the sentence. And a lot of students find it so challenging to study Latin if they have to just memorize all the endings in a
Hmm.
list. Where I actually teach my students, actually, there's a pattern here, there's a system here. And if you learn those, it's like you have this key and you unlock the system of the language. And it's not necessary to memorize lists. You don't have to know paradigms. You can actually react to forms when you see them in
I see.
translation instead of having to run through a list in your head to identify that form.
Right. That's it seems more natural too in that sense because
Mm-hmm.
I've often seen in languages which I love, but I'm not as well versed as I'd like to be, but I'm always
Mm-hmm.
trying to develop. And I've talked to my some of my students before, just in general about I think with like my little kids you see, right? Like how they'll say the silly thing, like they have no
Yes.
fear of just saying nonsense, like as they try to
Mm-hmm.
work this out. And I think maybe sometimes when we start learning languages later, do you think that's a challenge that we run into where we get that little self consciousness where we
Oh, yes.
just try to do what I got to
Absolutely.
do to pass the test, but I'm not willing to really be vulnerable. To be, maybe someone chuckles at me because I said something goofy, but that's the
Absolutely.
key of fuddling through it.
Yes, yes. And my students are almost always very hesitant to get on that mic and start because we start right out and I want them to start practicing forms. And so I just always encourage them that yes, this is nerve-wracking, this is a little scary, but everyone feels the same way as you. I want you to try. And they usually get incentives and extra credit or participation points, and usually pretty quickly within a few sessions they're all starting to relax and they're willing to try. And sometimes there is a chuckle here and there because it's just funny, and sometimes I say things incorrectly or have a mishap in class, and so I try to make it fun, and but they do have to work really hard. And but I also try to just, yes, encourage them not to be nervous about just branching out and exploring the language.
Wonderful. Well, anything else you want to share with us here about your courses, your approach, and or at least how people can get in touch with you or learn more? Hopefully, sign up.
So they can go to homeschoolconnections.com to find all of the courses that we're offering. I myself am the master Latin instructor, and so I've created a huge online program through different curricula that I've digitalized basically for other Latin instructors and for families. And so we have a huge offering of different levels, different curricula. You have quite a bit that you can pick from
Wow.
for all ages. So it's growing, and we're very excited about that.
That's so great. Well, Mrs. Henry, thank you so much for stopping by today and sharing with us about your Homeschool Connections courses.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Yep. God bless.